Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and today's going to be a special edition where we're having a conversation with somebody who's been a part of the Q community for a long time. He's been a presenter, been on multiple panels, and is a deep thinker. His name's Dreher, and he recently released a book called Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents. He also is the author of The Benedict Option. And it's a conversation we've had around this Q community for a long time. We care about thinking well, being curious, advancing good. We also care about thinking through the health of the church and what our role as the church is in a nation that's not necessarily Christian and a nation that's constantly changing and the context is changing. And so what does faithfulness look like? So Rod and I, in just a moment, I'm going to get to have a conversation with him and ask him a lot of questions. He sees a future coming that he would describe as totalitarianism, that there's a future coming where there's going to be more controls, less freedom, and it's going to start to affect a lot of things about the civic life that maybe we just take for granted. And so I want to get into that. I want to ask him questions about that. How is that possibly going to show up? How can we imagine that future? But then also, what does it mean to be faithful in the midst of a changing society where maybe as the church, you do lose some of your freedoms. You're not in a power position. You are a minority in the way in which the New Testament church was always a minority. So how do we find hope in that, even with change? And so I hope you'll listen in and be a part of this conversation. But I want to remind you, this conversation I'm having with Rod today, these are the conversations we will be having in 2 weeks, November 11th and 12th in Nashville, Tennessee, our exclusive gathering where we're bringing together 300 leaders in person, socially distanced, in a venue that's very large so that we can all have our space, but we can be in the same room the week after the election to talk about the issues that are ahead, some of the big issues that are critical for the church, for pastors, for leaders, for people concerned about where the church is headed, to wrestle with. And so we're going to have over 20 presenters. They're with us in person. This isn't a virtual event. They're going to be with us in the room. We're going to be having conversations like we've never done before at Q. Not just talks, but conversations. 45 minutes dedicated to each topic where we hear from these key presenters that we're curating. In addition to that, 30 minutes of Q&A from you, the person in the room. So you're not only going to get to hear about 8 topics that we believe are critical for the church and for Christians to be thinking through in the days ahead, but you're also going to get the opportunity to interact with other leaders who are thinking about a lot of what we'll talk about today. How do we build faithful communities amidst a changing culture? So some of those topics, we're talking about mental health and suicide. We're talking about civil unrest and elections. We're talking about censorship and conspiracies, digital discipleship, church history and deconstruction, race and justice, prayer and revival, Generation Z, so many things that in this one setting over 2 days are just going to inspire and encourage you. We're also going to invite people to join us virtually. So if you can't make the trip or that's just not something you're able to do or afford, we're going to make it available as well as a virtual event you can participate in, you can watch, you can listen in, even as we're meeting together in Nashville. You can take this back to your team, to your family, to those that you are doing life with, as it's going to create great conversations for you as well. So you can learn more about all of that at qideas.org/QA. That's qideas.org/QA. Go over there, check out these topics, the presenters, what the experience is going to be like, and join us while there's still some seats remaining. In addition to that, listen into this conversation. Let it give you just a little bit of a taste of taking a deep dive into a topic that maybe is misunderstood, maybe we haven't thought a lot about, but it's important for us to wrestle with as we consider faithfulness into the future. Let's listen in now. Well, Rod, I'm so grateful for you taking time to talk with us about such an important topic today. Thanks for being with us on the Q Podcast.
Glad to be here.
So first of all, you've became a friend of mine probably 8 years ago. We first crossed paths, and I always remembered about you that you had a prophetic imagination that allowed you to understand history, but to put it forward for us, to help us understand the times we're in, and to try to learn from that history. And even if it takes us to a place that maybe people don't desire, right? Would that be true of you? Do you see that as a pattern in your life?
Yeah, I think it really is the case with me. And I don't know whether it's a blessing or a curse, but it's just there. I can remember back in 2001 when I was a columnist at the New York Post and started writing about the Catholic Church's sex abuse scandal. I was a very devout Catholic at that time. And I can remember discovering these things over the next 3-4 years of continuing to write about it. And I was just astonished that things were as bad as they really were. But what also discouraged me and dismayed me, and eventually I think led to a spiritual crisis that ended with me leaving the Catholic Church, was seeing how many of my fellow Catholics, fellow believers, just refuse to contend to see with what was right in front of their eyes,
Yeah.
And I understand why they were doing it, because all the facts in front of them were challenging their worldview. They was challenging the structures, the psychological and emotional structures that they had in place that helped them feel at home in the world and make sense of the world. But the fact is, these things were true and they were happening, and eventually you can't run away from the truth. So that I'm experienced with this sort of thing, and it doesn't make me happy to say, hey, guess what, everybody? Guess what, church? Things are worse than we think, a lot worse. We better get ready for it. But I've been able to see from my own spiritual journey and just writing about the Catholic Church that you can't hide from truth. It will eventually find you, and if you have not prepared yourself spiritually for what's actually happening, you could be spiritually broken. That's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah, and that's a good word. And I think as I've gotten to know you, I've appreciated your voice, because it's one that I agree. There's plenty of people who don't want to think about some of the topics that you bring up and you're willing to raise about, the way the church is crumbling in a lot of ways for what we've known it to be in the Western world, or the way in which our society's changing in such a progressive way that it has the real opportunity to unroot so many of these virtues and values that for a long time have been a part of a free American society. And so we don't want to hear that, because that's bad news, and people don't want bad news. They want good news. And
right.
When you start talking about this, there are some that start to critique everything that you're saying and try to disprove it. And then there's others that I think I fall more in this camp, that appreciate it and go, this is a prophetic word coming from a man who understands where we've been, where we're going, is putting a faith in God that supersedes circumstance, and is going to take us deeper into a place where we can better understand the times, so that we can have some sense of what to do. And in this particular moment, as you wrote this latest book called Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents, I'm finding more and more people that are reading this book are resonating, and they're realizing, okay, this is scary, but feels true. When you wrote Benedict Option back several years ago, there was a little bit of a reaction from some who just said, this is too much. I don't think it's going this way. I don't think Christians are going to need to form much stronger bonds and commitments to one another in order to survive whatever this next season's going to look like. But I think looking back, it's kind of aged well.
Yeah, I think you're right. Although I still run into people, Christians, who say, well, I don't think we ought to head for the hills, like you say in the Benedict Option. And even 3 years later, I'll say, that's not what the book says. But
right.
They just have it in their mind that I'm being an unnecessary alarmist. But I'll tell you, with this new book, Live Not by Lies, it's a much easier sell as an idea to people, because of the things that we've all lived through for the past 3 years, and especially the past 6 months. I remember when I turned in the final manuscript of the book to my editor back in, I think it was late February, early March, I was still wondering, how am I going to convince my audience, American Christians, that we really are moving into a really bad place, potentially a form of totalitarianism. And then between that moment and publication in late September, COVID happened, and George Floyd and the riots happened, and now the book is selling like hotcakes because I don't have to try to convince people in the same way I had to do with Benedict option, because all they have to do is look at the news.
Yeah. Well, one of the big ideas you start to describe in this book is how to spot totalitarianism. You call it, and you write about it as a soft totalitarianism, which more and more people are starting to wake up to the big idea of it. But for listeners who haven't thought about totalitarianism or authoritarianism, I mean, just give us some definitions here of what is totalitarianism? What does that look like?
Well, authoritarianism is not the same thing as totalitarianism, and this is often confused in the public's mind, but political science says that authoritarianism is when you have a political system where all power is concentrated in one leader or one party. But outside the realm of politics, they don't really care what goes on in a society. Totalitarianism is an extreme form of authoritarianism in which all political power is held by one leader or the party, and all aspects of life are politicized. There is no aspect of life that escapes the ruling ideology. And I call what we're heading into soft totalitarianism because I distinguish it from the hard totalitarianism of, say, the Stalin-era Soviet Union or of George Orwell's 1984. You know, that's a totalitarianism in which the state compelled conformity by inflicting pain and terror on people with gulags, secret police, that sort of thing. This is more like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World style totalitarianism, in which the state compels conformity not by inflicting pain and terror, but by manipulating people's pleasures, their status, and their entertainment. And it's also, in our situation, it's not really the state. It's more of what I call the regime, which is to say some parts of the state, but also big corporations, Hollywood, mainstream media, universities, and other institutions. And it is going to be it is the kind of thing that people don't recognize at first as totalitarianism because it doesn't seem threatening. It seems virtuous, actually. They're trying to make us happier and deal with our anxieties. In the end, though, it is ultimately totalitarianism. And these people I talked to for the book, people who grew up under Soviet communism and who came to America, they see it for what it really is, and they're trying to wake us all up.
Yeah, well, I think in your book where you're talking about this, I just want to read one of the passages from it. You said, today's left-wing totalitarianism once again appeals to an internal hunger, specifically the hunger for a just society, one that vindicates and liberates the historical victims of oppression. It masquerades as kindness, demonizing dissenters and disfavored demographic groups to protect the feelings of victims in order to bring about social justice. I mean, those are strong words, but quite descriptive of, as you referenced, this 2020 year. We're seeing some of the demonization of dissenters, right?
That's right.
You know, whether it's Black Lives Matter as an organization and those who aren't willing to go there and show support for that, or we see it even in the COVID situation where those who don't want to play along with what the typical government restrictions might be, or wearing masks, or whatever it might be that's being instructed from on high, those who aren't playing along are certainly looked at and grouped as those who are against human flourishing.
That's right. That's right. And we can't have that. I got the idea for the book from a phone call I received in 2015. Your listeners might remember the battle in Indiana over the Religious Freedom Restoration Act there. The Republican state legislature back then and Governor Mike Pence signed a state version of the federal RFRA law, which all it would have done would be to give religious believers a religious liberty defense if they were sued for discrimination. It wouldn't guarantee that they won. It would just give them a defense. Well, as soon as that was passed, big business, Apple Computers, Salesforce, all kinds of major corporations came down like a ton of bricks on the state of Indiana and said, this is bigotry. If you don't repeal this, there will be major economic consequences. This was the first time that big business had taken sides in the culture war in that way, and it was decisive. The thing that sparked the book, though, was a phone call I received from a doctor at the Mayo Clinic. he told me that his mother, his elderly mother, lives with him and his wife. And when she was young, she grew up in Czechoslovakia, communist Czechoslovakia, and she spent 4 years in a prison camp for her faith. And now, living in America, she said, son, the things I'm seeing happen here remind me of what happened back home. What she was talking about specifically was she had seen on TV that when all this Indiana River stuff was going on, a TV reporter from a TV station in Indianapolis went to a small town and interviewed this couple, this family that owned a pizza parlor, Memories Pizza it was called. They were evangelicals. She asked them, would you be willing to serve gay customers? Of course, they said. She asked them, would you be willing to cater a gay wedding? They said, no, it's against our beliefs. When that went viral, there was some massive bonfire all over the country, people giving death threats to this couple, threatening to burn their business down, and so on and so forth. That made this Czech woman say to her son, this is exactly what it was like where I was growing up, when the government, in order to punish people who dissented from whatever the communist view was, would gin up a mob to try to threaten to burn people's businesses down and destroy them. And when that lady called me and said, or her son called me and said that, I thought it was really alarmist. But the more I started talking to people who had lived with this sort of thing, either in Russia or the Soviet bloc, the more I began to see things through their eyes and realize that they were seeing things that we in America are blind to, in part because we think that it can't happen here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this assumption that somehow there's no possible way in American life it could ever go that direction, that we've learned the lessons of history, that we're smarter than ever, we're more progressed as a society, and so we would never revert back to that. But obviously the way it's painted is not that this is a reversion, it's that it's a progression, right? That this is a better future for everybody, and that would have been painted years ago when, other revolutions came about that radically changed societies. And you talk about that, you tell this great so many stories of history, which I think really root this book and allow people to start to imagine in a different society, what did this look like? But you do start to apply it to our society in the sense of going, here's what you start to look out for. I remember you describing a professor, maybe you could talk about this, that there's a moment where when people are having to be hushed about their beliefs, that's when you know something new is starting to arrive in this free society. And how much more now are people feeling that as it relates to their social media post, who they're talking to in a room, what they're communicating, what they're typing, right? I mean, it's happening big time.
Oh, it's happening everywhere. Yeah, the professor you're talking about is an engineer, professor of engineering. He's from Czechoslovakia, immigrated here in his late 20s. And he said he knew that things were changing here when people he knew would fall silent when he would start talking about politics and start looking over their shoulders. This was a few years ago, to see who was listening. That same professor, by the way, told me, I don't think I use this in the book, he said that he has friends who work in the federal government for the federal bureaucracy, and they have to hide in their offices in Washington. They have to hide the fact that they support the President of the United States. Now, that's just bizarre, right? I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, but this is crazy when it's gotten to that point in this country. Just today, as you and I are talking, I don't know if you've even seen this news, but Facebook has demonetized the Babylon Bee for a satirical story they published about Senator Mazie Hirono and the Amy Coney Barrett hearings. This is a satirical site, and it's clearly satire, but Facebook says, oh, no, you're inciting violence. So this is directly affecting the ability of the people who run the Babylon Bee to make a living. It sounds, you compare this to totalitarianism, and you laugh at that sort of thing, because this is not Siberia, this is not the Gulag, but this is a sort of thing that's growing more and more and more, and it is definitely going to affect our ability not only to make a living, but to, I believe, to educate our children as Christians and to worship as Christians.
Yeah, free speech is such an important value to keeping a free society. And the moment that starts to be encumbered, just because you disagree with that other person's point of view, you've now started to enter into a new land where you're going to trust somebody else to determine what's good, what's true, what's moral, what's immoral, and we're taking it out of the hands of people. We're saying our people are too dumb to discern for themselves what's true information and what's false information. So we're going to take control of that, and we're seeing that in big tech. We're starting to see, voices, taken off of platforms, deplatformed, censored, and what I think most people don't understand is when that starts to happen, if we don't stand up and push back against that, even for somebody we completely disagree with their ideology, you're next.
Oh, yeah.
And we don't quite understand because we realize it might cost us something to push back or to even have conversations like you and I are having today, just to put it out there that, this is a real threat that we should be serious about no matter what political ideology you most align with. But as Americans, that there is an assault on free speech, I think is becoming obvious to people.
I hope so. I've been talking to different Christian professors, university professors, who are terrified within their own universities of being found out. They're moving deep into the closet as Christians because they understand how totalitarian the atmosphere, the emerging atmosphere in their institutions is. But they're telling me, too, that they said, Rod, you don't see it because, I'm 53 years old and I haven't seen a university campus in many years, but they're dealing with students today, and they say that the students are so different from the way they were when we were in school. Back then, whether you were liberal or conservative, you would clash, you would argue, you would have it out, but in the end, everybody believed that you should be able to say what's on your mind. They tell me today, young people don't like that. They have been raised in a bubble, a coddling by their own parents and by the institutions in which they've been raised that tells them that they shouldn't have to put up with any anxiety at all, anything that upsets them at all. And the institutions that have been there to form them, their churches, education, and so on and so forth, have played along with this. So you end up with things that happen, like what happened at Yale University in 2015, in which Dr. Nicholas Christakis, you can see this on YouTube, a professor there, was trying to have an argument on the quad with some students who were really angry at his wife for saying that Yale should not tell students what kind of Halloween costumes they can wear. Something as trivial as that. The students got angry at her because they wanted Yale to be paternalistic and tell them, you can't wear these things. Well, if you go back and look at this argument they had, there is Christakis, a baby boomer, trying to have a sincere discourse, listening to the students, offering his feedback. They don't want to have anything to do with it. They're shrieking at him. They curse him. They're having these emotional displays, accusing him of denying their right to exist just for disagreeing with them. I think there's a tremendous generational shift here that a lot of us older people in the church just haven't wrapped our minds around.
Yeah, because you wouldn't have imagined that could have happened. But you're right. I find the next generation to be much quieter around these issues. Even if they disagree, they're likely not going to talk about it because they don't want to create division or even out themselves with a different view than maybe what the mainstream view is. And even, during this season with COVID and all that, to see how much even medical doctors, right, are being censored because they have a different opinion about what's happening or how to solve COVID. And if it doesn't align with the World Health Organization, even Facebook and other big tech, there's warnings, there's taken down videos. You can't access this information. This isn't about religion. This is about just saying, hey, there's an alternative viewpoint than what the dominant authority might have. And we want to shut that down because maybe it's a threat.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a fear.
In the book, I write about a physician, a senior physician at a major American hospital, who told me about how his hospital, how his institution handles transgender. He said that it made a decision, the hospital made a decision that anybody who comes in wanting cross-sex hormones or surgery to transition to the opposite sex, give them whatever they ask for, even if, in your judgment as a physician, this is not what's best for them, that they would be better, their dysphoria would be better treated in some other way. Now, this physician grew up in the Soviet Union. He said it wasn't even this bad in the Soviet Union because they expected us to obey the political ideology in other realms of life, but at least in medicine, things were pretty clear. They left us alone. But now this is happening in the United States. And this doctor said that even on his social media feeds, he only puts the happiest, most anodyne, ordinary, have a nice day things, because he knows that the hospital's human resources department is monitoring the social media accounts of all the doctors there. So, I mean, and this is just an ordinary thing in daily life, but you see how we're becoming groomed to silence ourselves. And this is also how totalitarianism works. They only have to make one or two examples to teach everybody to be quiet.
Is there something unique, Rod, in your experience in sort of American life and in the culture that's been created here that I know there's a sense maybe we've lost that, maybe it's not still here, but that there's something peculiar about Americans that will push back on this in the season ahead if this starts to continue to creep in? Or do you think we're so far down the road that there's not many people that even understand other values to see it clearly and to know how to push back?
I'm afraid I'm more pessimistic about this. I remember in my research for the Benedict option, I read a lot of the work of Christian Smith, the sociologist of religion at Notre Dame, and he's the guy who came up with the concept of moralistic therapeutic deism as the true religion of Americans. And he was especially hard on millennials and Gen Z Christians, saying that, even those who identify as Christians say that the thing that they're most interested in life is being happy and having a good time. And this is not something that people grow out of. This is something that has become more general, this attitude towards life and what is the good life. It's even pretty strongly in the baby boomers and Gen X, my generation, but it's really strong in the younger ones. And if that's the way you judge the world through so I guess you could call it an anthropology of expressive individualism, that is to say that what it means to live a fully human life is to do whatever you want that makes you happy and to shake off all fetters, whether it's fetters of religion, of history, of family, anything that keeps you from realizing your own self as you define yourself, then it must be gotten rid of. If that's how people see the world, then we're not going to have what it takes to resist this soft totalitarianism. I'll give you a really frightening example. When I was in Poland last year doing research for the book, talking to young Catholics in their 20s, people who are still church-going Catholics, they all told me, said, yeah, in 10 years, maybe 20 years, this country will be just like Ireland is today, be completely secular. And, I grew up in the Pope John Paul II era, and I always thought of Poland as being a bastion of faith in an increasingly godless European continent. But they all tell me, and this was confirmed when I went to other countries in the Eastern Bloc, the post-communist generation wants to be free of history. They don't want to know about what happened, what their parents went through and their grandparents went through, because they see that as a weight on them that keeps them from realizing the life they want for themselves, which is to be hedonistic consumers. And to be fair to them, their parents and grandparents don't really want to burden them with the painful memories of the past either. So what they're doing is sleepwalking, like the rest of us, into a soft totalitarian future.
Yeah, and you describe so well in this book. I wish we had time. I mean, you and I could spend 3 hours talking about all of what's in here. I'm excited that you're going to be with us at our Q&A gathering in November, where so many people are going to get to meet you, and we'll go deeper than what we're even able to do here, as well as have the opportunity for people to ask questions. But you describe progressivism in religion and what that looks like as religion, progressivism as religion. I think that's a huge topic. We won't get into all of that. But where it starts to take the turn, and this is what to me is so inspiring about you presenting this thesis, is that the solution is to live in truth. Okay? It's like a very simple solution when you start to get your head around what it means to live in truth, and you describe it so well, and you start to give examples of what does it mean even when you're living in a society where falsehood has started to take root, where language and words have lost their meaning and new ones have taken on that meaning. What do you do? Because it can be a very confusing time, and you start at like the most nuclear level. You start with the family and the individual living in truth and deciding what to compromise and what not to compromise. Would you just describe a little bit about this idea of what it means to live in truth?
the idea comes, first of all, from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The title of my book, Live Not by Lies, is the title of the final essay he wrote in 1974 before he was thrown out of the Soviet Union. And in the essay, he told people, he said, listen, we can't do anything about this totalitarian government that rules us, but the one thing we can do, at least, is to not say things we know to be false. And he talked about if you will choose to live not by lies, to live in truth, in other words, then you won't go to public meetings and be counted as agreeing with things that you don't agree with, and so on and so forth. It requires the willingness to sacrifice, even at a small level. I tell a story in there, too, about Václav Havel, the Czech dissident who later became the first president of a free Czechoslovakia. Havel told a story about the mythical greengrocer. It's a greengrocer who, like every other shopkeeper under communism, he has to hang up a sign in his window that says, "Workers of the world, unite." Well, one day the greengrocer decides, you know what, I don't believe this. I'm not going to put it in the window just to avoid trouble. Well, trouble comes to him. The government comes by. Maybe they take away his business. His kids can't go to university. He can't travel, et cetera, et cetera. He really suffers. But the thing he has gained by showing other people that it is possible to live in truth has been immeasurable. He has won not only a moral victory for himself, but he has spread the word to other people in society who know that the whole system is supported by lies, and who know that if they are willing to join him and accept suffering too, then maybe they can overturn the system. And in fact, everybody I talked to over there, none of them believed that they would live to see the end of communism, but they did. And those who were able to live by truth, who were willing to accept even going to prison for the sake of the truth and the sake of Christ, if they were Christians, they were vindicated. But they were very much in the minority over there. I think that one of the most amazing things to me was to be in Moscow and talking to people who had been part of the rebirth of Christianity in the early 70s in Moscow. I talked to one man who had been an atheist, but who said that he was so disgusted with all the lies of the Soviet Union that he would look around. The only people he saw that had any sort of joy or connection to the truth were these young Christians. And he became a Christian, joined their number, and he said even when we would get together in apartments to pray and just be together to sing hymns, we knew the KGB was outside waiting for us, but just to taste the freedom that we had together worshiping Christ made it all worthwhile. That man later went to prison for his beliefs.
Well, and you describe how when we live in this truth, it does start at the family level, but it moves to small communities. And I want to be proactive here with those who are listening, who are, learning about this maybe for the first time, or maybe not as aware of some of the things you see coming down the pike that could grow more and more controlling. I think this COVID moment has certainly wakened people up to how quickly things can move local, how important local relationships are in getting along, how important church is and what defining church and what your church community is, and how you're going to work together as a community to serve and meet one another's needs during a crisis. But talk a little bit about why community and forming communities, how that's essentially the strategy now, is we should be forming stronger, tighter bonds. I feel like it beckons back to the Benedict option.
Oh, absolutely. I dedicate this book, Live Not by Lies, to this Catholic priest named Father Tomislav Kolakovic. He was a Croatian who was doing anti-Nazi work in Croatia, in Zagreb, in 1943. He got a tip that the Gestapo was coming for him, so he sneaked out of the country, went to his mom's homeland, Slovakia, adopted her last name, Kolakovic, and began teaching at a Catholic university there. And what he told the young people gathered around him, these young Catholics, was this. He said, the good news is the Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is that the Soviets are going to be ruling this country when it's over with, and the first thing the communists are going to do is come after the church, so we have to be ready. Now, the bishops of Slovakia said, oh, you're being alarmist, don't scare people. But Father Kolakovic had studied Soviet communism because he wanted to do missionary work there, and he knew their mindset. So what he did was organize students into small prayer groups. They would come together not only to pray and to study scripture, but also to talk about what was actually happening in the real world around them and to figure out what they as Christians were required to do to react to it. They also did things like learning the arts of resistance, like how to survive an interrogation. He spread these prayer groups all over Slovakia. It happened very quickly, like within 2 or 3 years. When the Iron Curtain fell on that country, the first thing the communists did was come after the church. And the prayer groups that Father Kolakovich had set up became the backbone for the underground church for the next 40 years. I dedicate this book to him because I believe that we are in a different sort of Kolakovich moment when Christians need to find each other right now to open our eyes to what's happening in the world, to talk about how we can be faithful Christians and build resilience and resistance and be ready for times getting tougher. Now, it does sound alarmist. I freely admit that. But when you read this book and you hear what these people who lived through it, what they're seeing happen now, you realize we don't have time to waste.
Yeah, and you talk a little bit about this idea of faithfulness. It doesn't always mean that you win over the authoritarian or totalitarian government or leaders. There's something about the suffering in the midst of it. There's something about this faithfulness where we're trusting God with what He's doing through this and what He's doing through us and what He's going to do through the church that also can bring us hope that it doesn't all rest in our hands. We don't have to be the ones to defeat that enemy by taking on the same tactics that the enemy may take on, but that there's something about being a follower of Christ that pushes us to a deeper level. Can you describe for those listening just a little more of what some of the benefits can be for the church, for the Christian, to walk through times that may look very different than what you'd have ever hoped for or anticipated or planned for, but that God can use in our own depth?
Yeah, I think the most important chapter in this book is the one on suffering, because as all of these people testify that if you're not able to suffer for the gospel, then you're not going to make it. I remember standing on a street corner in Moscow, and I quote him in this book, but this white-haired Russian Baptist pastor, he's an old man now, his father and all the men in their church had been sent away to the Gulag by Stalin, but there he is today talking, and he looked at me square in the eyes and said, "You go home and tell the Americans that if you're not willing to suffer, your faith is nothing but hypocrisy." What they meant by that is that what they're trying to say to us is that we are so blessed in this country. We've been so free and so rich for so long that we've gotten soft and decadent. We have forgotten that the history of the church from the crucifixion onward, especially in the early church, has been one of suffering and of bearing witness to Christ by our willingness to go even to our deaths if it requires that as martyrs. This is not extraordinary. This is ordinary Christianity. We are the ones in the United States who've become, who are extraordinary in terms of history, in that we've been able to enjoy religious freedom and so forth. We have gotten to the point in our churches, and all churches, not just Protestant, Catholic, whatever, where the gospel that is preached is a gospel of comfort and ease and therapy. When in fact, we need to hear stories about these men and these women who were willing to go into prison and not curse God for being in prison and not be broken by it, but rather to look at the suffering they were handed and ask themselves, what does it mean to be faithful here where I am? In this COVID thing, I was feeling pretty sorry for myself a couple of months in because we weren't able to have church at all by orders of our government and our bishops here in Louisiana. And I said, I really miss church. Woe is me. But then I started thinking about some of these people I had talked to, and this one man in particular, Dr. Sylvester Kuchmery, he was a young Slovak Christian who was thrown into prison on false charges in 1952, and he was tortured in prison. But he says in his memoir that he never would let himself pity himself because that would be the spiritual death of him and other people. So what he did was to ask himself, what does God ask of me now? How can I be faithful right here with these burdens He's given me? And he used that as a time to grow deeper in his commitment to Christ and into serving other people who are suffering in prison. I get this story over and over again, and this right there is going to be the thing that saves us, that causes us to throw ourselves fully into Christ's arms and to carry this suffering, even if the suffering is not persecution, like to be thrown into jail, but if the suffering is simply not being able to go to church on Sunday, we've got to be able to suffer with serenity and confidence in our hearts. Last thing, somebody pointed out to me recently that James Stockdale, he was one of the most famous Vietnam-era prisoners of war. He was for years in a Hanoi prison. He was asked in the year 2000, who are the ones who made it out and who are the ones who didn't make it of the prisoners? He said, that's easy. The optimists were the ones who didn't make it out. The interviewer said, well, what do you mean the optimists? He said, yeah, they were the ones who kept saying things like, we'll be home by Christmas. We'll be home by Easter. Christmas came, Easter came, they were still there, and eventually they lost all faith. He said, the ones who were hopeful, not optimistic, but hopeful, who believed that ultimately their sacrifice was going to prevail over their captors, but who also were realistic enough to tell themselves, it might not happen in the next year, it might not happen for 2 years, but we will prevail eventually. Those were the ones that came through. That difference between optimism and hope is something really important for the church in America to learn today.
Yeah, it's a good word and a good place for us to start to wrap up this conversation, because I think we need that hope that goes so much deeper than what a world around us might say is happiness or avoiding the pain of suffering. And when I hear you talk, Rod, I just see this like picture of a man who's just saying, wake up, wake up, wake up, and it might sound alarmist to some, but God calls different people to different posts, and you have this unique calling to help people wake up. Final question for you. It does feel like a lot of people want to avoid thinking about this. There's the idea of cognitive dissonance, and that we want to live in a world that makes sense and that assumes the best about intentions, and that is hopeful, right, in that regard, but in some ways can disregard and bury our head in the sand, and we disregard some real facts around us, some real truths that if we were wise, we would see it and we would prepare for it. What do you think it is about the human that just launches towards these narratives that might down the road cause them more suffering because they weren't prepared? They didn't take the time to realize what was staring at them.
It's as old as Scripture, I mean, can you imagine the people who are standing around in Noah's day watching the alarmist Noah and his sons building an ark and say that, the rain is going to stop sooner or later? I think that it's human nature not to want to challenge ourselves, to challenge the structures we built around ourselves, to tell ourselves that everything's going to be okay. I think that I don't know, man, it really gets me down to see so many pastors who are leaving their flocks out there undefended. Mm-hmm. I talk to ordinary Christians who are wondering what's happening to their kids. Their kids are coming home from kindergarten, first grade, and they're getting transgender stuff thrown at them at an early age, and the parents don't know what to do. And they're not getting any real leadership from people in the church because so many pastors seem to be afraid to speak these hard truths, to take a stand that will make them hated, perhaps, in this society. And I'm not talking about being like right-wing extremists or anything like that. I'm talking about standing on basic Christian truth. So parents are having to figure it out for themselves. Young people having to figure it out for themselves because the pastors are so afraid to say things that are going to upset people, because these people, young people, have been raised in a culture that tells them that anything upsetting is to be shunned. I think we need just to get real, not frighten ourselves into paralysis, but rather just be realistic about what's coming and prepare for it right now. Otherwise, we're going to be swept away.
Yeah, well, good words. And I do think this next generation has a resilience to them that when challenged, they do want to think. They want to know what's true. They're awakening to the lies that they've been told for a long time. And I think there's an incredible opportunity in this. And I just want to encourage you, if you're listening, don't let this conversation depress you. Don't make it think, don't walk away from this just going, oh my goodness, the sky is falling. I think what we should do as believers is we go, look, let me just take in this wisdom to make sure I'm doing what we've all already been called to do as Christians. discipling my family, discipling the community around me, being a part of a resilient church that's going to be faithful, that's going to tell the truth about sin and about human nature, and is going to be willing to confront that. And let's do the things we've already been called to do. That's going to prepare you for anything that we may not be able to foresee coming in the future. So for everybody, Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents by Rod Dreher. I couldn't recommend this enough as a very important read for communities, for churches, for people to just have a higher awareness. As we talk about at Q, we want to stay curious and we want to think well. This will help you think well about all the dynamics at play right now in our media, in our culture, and in our conversations. And we want you to think well so that you can be faithful at advancing true good. So, Rod, thank you for being with us, and we hope you have a great week.
Thanks for having me. And I can't wait to see folks in Nashville. We need each other as the church, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. One thing I found out from the people over there who were in prison is that all these denominational differences melted away in prison because none of them were there because they were evangelical or Catholic or Orthodox. They were all there because they were followers of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Thank you for that encouragement.